Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, we're going to be talking about one of my all-time favorite topics to talk about, which is, of course, the Wheel of Time. So if you've seen any of my stuff or talked to me, most people know I'm a really big Wheel of Time fan. Prominently up on the top shelf that has a Wheel of Time symbol, some of the other Wheel of Time things there as well. Favorite series, I've read it many times, and today what I wanted to talk about is breaking down the different sections of the books. So I've thought a lot about this over time, and especially doing the reread that I'm currently working on now, which had been the first time in a few years, and wanted to talk about it because there was a lot of debate on the different areas of the Wheel of Time books, how this part works, that part, what sections there are, the slog, all that kind of thing. So there's a lot of debate there. And so this is my take and kind of the way that I think about these books, which hopefully will be interesting for those of you who've read and maybe helpful for those of you who are wanting to know a little bit about how the different books work and talk about it. So let's jump in. So first off, we have the introduction books. So this is the first three books, The Eye of the World, The Great Hunt, and The Dragon Reborn, and this really is kind of the introduction. Now, why am I saying the first three books are an introduction? Well, the first three follow a very different kind of formula than the rest of the series does, and part of that is they do follow a kind of basic fantasy formula. We have at the end of each of the first three books events where, with minor tweaks, it could have been the end of the series, and that's kind of how it started with. There was a ton, obviously, too. And even in the very first book, extremely early on, there's so much foreshadowing for events that happen all the way up to the very last book and all kinds of stuff in between. But the first three books are written in a little bit more of a formulaic way, a little bit more of the classic fantasy story, definitely has some elements of Lord of the Rings in there, and is following that part and just introducing you to the world, setting it up so that, okay, this climax could be the end. Both 1, 2, and 3 both have events that could have been done that way if it would not have continued on. And with the Wheel of Time originally being pitched as a trilogy, it makes sense that this was the approach taken. We're going to see how this does, and it being wildly popular, so of course it got more. Even the original deal, it was pitched as a trilogy, and they're like, nah, we'll give you 6 because you run a little bit long. True. But it was pitched that way, and so that's kind of the way that it's written, where really any of them could have been the end. So it starts out that way, and it's one of those things too, sometimes people read them and they seem like, oh, this is a little formulaic, and maybe they aren't a fan of that. Other people really like that kind of thing. I know that for me, the early books always hold that kind of special place for me, but that ends with book 3 is really the last one that follows that specific formula where we're doing, the good versus evil, we have a showdown, that kind of thing. And there's still really big climaxes for every book, but it definitely changes up after there, which brings us to our next section, which I'm going to call the bigger picture books. So the bigger picture books, which are The Shadow Rising, Fires of Heaven, and Lord of Chaos. I call them that because these are the books where we start to really move on, really to the bigger picture. The first 3 are written in a little bit more of a condensed way, where anything could end, but this is the point where we know that we're going to get to really go for the full story. So we start expanding out a little bit and pulling in a lot more things, but instead of just looking at the basic good versus evil, this is where we start to see that, oh, there's a ton more. We get to meet new groups of people, we see new different cultures and societies, and how all of these different groups of people are going to be pulled together into the story, into really expanding in that bigger picture. Try not to use the word expanding, as you'll see in a moment here, but it does really generally happen. Book 4 immediately opens up the world quite a lot more, and it's one of the reasons why it tends to be a favorite for a lot of people, because that's the first book where you really kind of break out and are going to different places, doing different things. And from there, it really does not stop with how much more we pull in. So those books are where we're still dealing with big things. There's still going to be big climaxes that have really big impacts, but it's more about the story progressing than setting up this potential end that you really got with the first 3. that leads us into the next section, which, yes, I know, is often called the slog, but I'm going to refer to it as the expansion books. See now why I said, like, I don't really want to use the term expansion as much for the other ones, because these are really what I would consider to be the expansion books. So this is, of course, Crown of Swords, Path of Daggers, Winter's Heart, and Crossroads of Twilight. And it's kind of debatable whether or not Crown of Swords fits into this group. Some people don't include it when they call it the slog, some people do. So I'm just including it here because I think it still fits in that general scope here. So this is often referred to as the slog. And why do people call it the slog? Well, things do slow down quite a lot here. And especially Crown of Swords is kind of in the middle. It starts the slow down a little bit, but Path of Daggers is the one that really starts a lot of plot lines that are then going to continue to be explored for the next 2 books. And so some plot lines don't get resolved for a while. And so it's kind of that slow down. It also was the time where the publishing of the books was slowing down a little bit. So it was taking a little longer for people to get the new book. And we were still dealing with the same plot lines. And so it kind of got that bad rap as the slog. But really, these books, while they do definitely slow down, the reason it's really doing it is to continue to expand. We already have the books just prior to this that kind of start showing us the bigger picture, but now we're really expanding out both to new places, new people, new characters, new POVs. We're starting to bring in some of the smaller side characters more and focus on where they fit into the story. And so we're doing a ton more with that. And we're focusing on some other plot lines as well, and getting back to some characters we hadn't seen as much from. And that's something Jordan did too, where sometimes if a character was featured really heavily in one book and another character featured less, well, then maybe we'll focus more on that character and we'll look less at this kind of person. So that can happen, but there's so much world building that is done here. And without obviously going into spoilers for people who have not read the series, we introduce once again some really large plots, some really big players, people that are going to be important later, and instead of just introducing these people and being like, okay, they're here now, we're really integrating them into the story with this, and just world building is a really big focus. I could have called these the world building books, but there was just so much world building all throughout the Wheel of Time that I didn't think that would really fit. But this is kind of the slow down and expand as we go even wider, and really have a lot to do with why the world of the Wheel of Time is so incredibly rich. If you condensed the stories that happened here, especially the 3 books after Crown of Swords, you could probably condense quite a lot and get it. And would you still get a good story? Yes, but you wouldn't have quite as much depth. And now some people don't really care for that. Some people are like, I just want to move on and get to it. So that's something to be aware of. The pace is slowed down here, but there's still definitely quite a lot to enjoy here. As of filming this, the last one in the reread I finished was Path of Daggers. And Crown of Swords and Path of Daggers were actually both stronger books than I remembered them being, because it had been a few years and so many of the plot points had kind of gone together, which is why I was waiting until I was pretty deep in the reread. I'm like, okay, now I remember what's happening each book instead of having it all be one long plot in my head. But they're still strong books. Winter's Heart, it does slow down a little bit, and Crossroads of Twilight is pretty much universally recognized as the weakest book of the trilogy, or not the trilogy, the weakest book of the series, which, any series as it gets long enough, you're going to have some books that are better than others. And Wheel of Time really doesn't have a lot of, not great books, in my opinion, at least, because I'm a fan, but there's always a lot going on. Even Crossroads of Twilight has some big moments in it, but it is where we've really gone down to the fever pitch of kind of slowness there. We start to slow down in Crown of Swords. Path of Daggers, still lots happening because we're setting up plots. Winter's Heart and Crossroads of Twilight we're largely dealing with things that are set up in Path of Daggers, and we go from there. But like I said, I don't know. I've never been a huge fan of the whole slog idea just because I feel like it's exaggerated. Yes, there is a slowdown, but there's still so much rich world building. Plots are still going on. Characters are still being developed. There's still a lot happening. It's not like everything just stops for these 4 books. And then finally, after that, we get to the next section, which I'm calling the Race to the Finish. So this consists of Knife of Dreams, The Gathering Storm, Towers of Midnight, and A Memory of Light. And why am I calling this Race to the Finish? Well, Knife of Dreams picks up the pace big time. We have a lot of plots that are getting resolved around that time, either just before or during that book, and we are starting to really move forward quickly, and that's where we've set up everything that needs to be set up, and so we can kind of just roll with it and go from there. So Knife of Dreams is the book that really started to push things back in the quicker pace. It's still Robert Jordan, so it's not like it's the fastest paced thing in the world, but the pace picks up quite a lot, and then we got to the point where Sanderson took over for the last three, and despite how big the last three are, the pace is very quick. We're really going and getting everything where it needs to go and continuing all these plot lines and moving them on to the finale. I wouldn't say that they're streamlined or anything, it's just that we've spent a lot of time on a lot of the big plots, and so we're ready for the characters to move forward, and so that kind of race to the finish where there's so much that happens and the pace is a lot quicker. So you will see sometimes too, people who aren't huge Wheel of Time fans often end up really still enjoying the last books, and sometimes they'll be like, oh, this is a lot better than the several before. Whereas it's funny because like the hardcore Wheel of Time fans before the series was finished, a lot of them were like, I don't like the Sanderson stuff because it's different. I still really enjoyed the books. I think he did as good a job as anybody could have or would have done, and nobody would have done better, so I still really enjoy them personally myself. But it's definitely, you can't deny that the pace really is picked up starting at Knife of Dreams and then going into the three books that Sanderson co-authored and finished, bringing us to the final conclusion of the series. And there's just so much, and The Wheel of Time is definitely a series where you're not going to get answers to all of the questions. You definitely get a lot, but there are still to this day people who argue about even some things in the last book, like what actually happened here, what's going on, because there is just so much to still theorize about. And because it's such a huge world, while we have a ton of plots that are resolved, there's still a lot of things to have you be able to imagine what's going to happen after. Originally, there were going to be some additional prequels, and there were going to be some Outrigger novels that were exploring more what happens after the events of the series conclude. But even without that, it's just, you can definitely imagine a lot, and it's, once again, makes it such an easy series to really just dive into hard. Now, as a side note, I haven't mentioned yet New Spring. And so New Spring usually is recommended to be read after book 5. That's kind of in the middle, and I didn't mention it because it doesn't fit directly into one of my categories, but after book 5 is also what I recommend. I wouldn't do it any earlier than that, just because it's one of those things where it's a prequel and you want to wait until you're kind of deeper in and you know what's going on. You would definitely not want to start with it because it kind of would then take away from, especially the first 3 books, just a lot of stuff there. And it's not also like the most essential read either, so like you could read it when you're done with the series. On rereads, I usually read it first. That's kind of where I've gone to starting the series now. But your first time through, I do agree with the consensus that after book 5 is a really good spot to read New Spring, just because once you get there, it's kind of a good point to be like, okay, I'm going to go back and read this prequel, and then continue on as events continue to get bigger and bigger, so it fits really nicely there. So that is my breakdown of the different sections of the Wheel of Time books. Let me know in the comments if you've read it and you agree or disagree with anything that I said here. I know there's a lot of debate, like I said in the introduction, about the different books and the different sections, but this is kind of how I look at them. We have the introductory books, we have the bigger picture books, we have the expansion books, and then we race to the finish line to complete the series, and that's kind of, especially on my reread, I think is a pretty good way to put it, at least for me. So let me know your thoughts. Definitely interested to hear from you. Make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Check the link in the description, as always, for the Wizardly Duet Discord if you want to chat books, whether Wheel of Time, of course, or any books or really anything at all. It's a lot of fun and we would love to have you. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.